Most clans fought to win. This one fought to continue, even when victory no longer existed, even when the war had already destroyed everything worth ruling. They did not fear defeat. They feared something worse, a world without war. Subscribe to Fragments of History, because some wars don't end. They hollow out the people fighting them. The Yamana clan held territory, pressed up against Asakura land, close enough that borders were not lines, but wounds. In many ways, they were mirrors, militarized, honor-bound, strategically placed, and constrained by the same hunger for limited resources. That symmetry made coexistence fragile from the beginning. Two clans built for force, competing over the same narrow margins, could not share space for long. The first clash was small, a disputed rice paddy, a boundary argued over in mud and water, then steel followed. Within months, the skirmish widened into full warfare, not because the field mattered, but because it was the kind of spark both societies were already soaked in. That first conflict ended without resolution. Men died on both sides, neither gained lasting ground. Eventually, exhaustion forced a ceasefire. By any practical measure, it should have closed the dispute. A stalemate, bitter but final. Instead, it planted a tradition. Neither clan could accept that nothing had been decided. For the Asakura, withdrawal was not strategy. It was identity collapse. They had poured bodies, supplies, and honor into the fight. To accept an inconclusive end would mean admitting those sacrifices purchased nothing. So the ceasefire was not peace. It was a pause, the way a fighter takes a breath before leaning back in. The Yamana felt the same pressure from the other side of the border. They had lost men defending their ground. Those deaths demanded meaning, and meaning demanded a conclusion, victory clear enough to justify the cost. So they treated the silence as tactical space, time to rebuild and sharpen. War continued, even when fighting stopped, because in their minds, it never truly ended. Within a decade, violence returned on a thin excuse, a border violation, an insult, a broken agreement that may never have been agreed upon. The reasons were interchangeable. They didn't matter. What mattered was that the Yamana existed, and as long as they existed, the Asakura had a purpose that felt clean and complete. The second conflict lasted longer and achieved less. Ground changed hands, then changed back. Battles were won and lost without shifting the deeper balance. Thousands died, and the world remained the same shape when the smoke cleared. Another ceasefire arrived, not as resolution, but as attrition's limit. And again, both sides treated it as temporary, like a door left slightly open on purpose. By the third generation, no one could name the beginning. The rice paddy was a story without weight. The original insult had dissolved into rumor. Yet the war remained solid because it no longer needed origins. It had become inheritance. Fathers taught sons how to speak of Yamana tactics. Mothers raised children with the quiet certainty that they would fight the same enemy their ancestors had faced. The conflict outlived its cause and became self-sustaining. Young Asakura warriors grew up with one enemy carved into their thinking. They did not study Japan's shifting alliances or the wider machinery of the Sengoku period. They studied the Yamana, their commanders, their habits, their terrain, their weaknesses. Their education was not political, it was specific. Their identity did not form against the world, it formed against a single rival. That narrowed their worldview until the Yamana stopped being opponents and became the opponent. Other conflicts were distractions, practice, or preparation. The Asakura did not fight wars in the plural. They fought one war, singular, recurring, and endless, against the enemy that mattered enough to define them. Collective memory followed the same shape. Clan history was not recorded as peaceful years or administrative reforms. It was stored as battle names. The pass where a line broke, the castle that held for 3 days, the river where an ambush failed. These events were revisited like ritual. Survivors repeated them until they sounded like scripture. Children learned the clan's past as a sequence of confrontations with the Yamana. Defeats were not allowed to stay as defeats. When Asakura forces were routed at Akayama and hundreds died, the story did not become a warning. It became a testament. The dead were praised for refusing to yield, for holding honor even as the field was lost. The outcome was irrelevant. The willingness to continue was elevated into virtue. This reframing was not optional. If a defeat was acknowledged as failure, then the deaths were waste. If the war was questioned, then the sacrifices turned meaningless. The clan could not afford that thought, so disaster was rewritten as courage. Loss became proof of character, not evidence of error. Victories carried a different danger. They threatened to end things. When the Asakura won decisively, when they took territory or cut down Yamana leaders, the rational move would have been to press until the rival could not recover. But total victory required a finality their culture could not tolerate. Ending the war meant ending the purpose that had organized their lives. So victories were celebrated, then curiously left unfinished. A pattern formed. They would take a castle, then withdraw instead of consolidating. They would break an enemy line, then fail to destroy what remained. They would remove key commanders, then allow time for the Yamana to reorganize. Whether deliberate or unconscious, they kept the conflict alive because continuation mattered more than conclusion. The Yamana mirrored them. They also made honor out of defeat. They also failed to exploit advantage. Both clans became trapped in the same sick symmetry. Neither could truly win, because winning meant losing the relationship that defined them. The enemy became the source of meaning. When an Asakura child asked why he trained, the answer was simple: to fight the Yamana. When a warrior asked why he sacrificed, the answer was the same: to defeat the Yamana. When someone asked what their lives were for, the war provided the only response the clan trusted. And in that certainty, the future disappeared. Asakura leaders did not plan for peace. They did not imagine what the clan might become if the fighting stopped. They planned for the next engagement, the next campaign, the next generation, to inherit the same hatred and the same duty. Tomorrow was not a different world. It was more of the same. The economy bent around it. Resources that could have diversified life were poured into weapons. Land that could have been developed was kept clear for marching. Trade that required stable borders was neglected, not because alternatives were impossible, but because alternatives were not considered legitimate. War did not consume everything because there was too little. It consumed everything because nothing else was allowed to matter. Anyone who suggested otherwise was corrected sharply. Trade with the Yamana was betrayal. Negotiated borders were cowardice. Asking whether the war still served a purpose was dangerous, because it threatened the only structure holding their identity together. Some saw the truth anyway. A few recognized that the conflict had become automatic, that neither side could win, that resources were being burned into nothing, but they could not speak openly without being ruined, expelled, silenced, killed. So they stayed quiet, and the machine kept turning. Over time, the relationship between Asakura and Yamana became almost intimate in its intensity. They knew each other better than they knew anyone else. They predicted each other's tactics. They recognized commanders by posture and banner. Battles began to feel like choreography, familiar, expected, and grimly reliable. That familiarity created a twisted stability. The war was devastating, but it was certain. You knew who your enemy was. You knew what you were for. You knew your role. The alternative, peace, the ambiguity of self-definition, the need to build meaning from something other than conflict, was terrifying precisely because it had no script. So they stayed inside the war they understood, and as decades stretched toward a century, neither clan fully noticed the most dangerous change of all. The world beyond their border was moving on, quietly, decisively, toward a kind of power their war could not touch. The Asakura clan rose during Japan's Sengoku period, an age when conflict wasn't a season, it was the weather. In Echizen province, their land sat in a position that mattered, but it offered little else. The soil could feed people, but it could not enrich them. Rice sustained life. It did not create power, so the clan found power in the only currency that multiplied on barren ground: force. That limitation shaped everything. Echizen could not buy security through surplus or trade. It had to take it, defend it, and keep taking it again. The Asakura became warriors, not out of pride, but out of necessity. They turned warfare into a craft because warfare was the one resource their territory could produce without failing. Boys were raised to fight, girls were raised to keep fighters standing. The clan's society narrowed itself into a single purpose: generating and sustaining military strength. Training began before children understood what it was for. At 5 or 6, bodies were hardened, running until lungs burned, climbing until hands split, endurance drilled into muscle as if muscle could become a shield. By 8, wooden swords were placed in small hands. By 10, they were pushed into formations, taught to move as one organism. By 12, training stopped being a metaphor. Live exercises carried consequences. Serious injury was not rare. Death was not impossible. It wasn't cruelty for spectacle. It was calibration for reality. A warrior who hesitated died. A warrior who tired too soon collapsed. A warrior who broke formation endangered everyone beside him. The methods were brutal because battle was worse, and the clan's survival depended on meeting that reality without flinching. Everything a child learned pointed toward war. Reading and writing existed mostly for orders, reports, and the minimum literacy needed to obey. Mathematics meant supplies, distances, timing. History was a chain of battles, names, tactics, errors that must never be repeated. Art, when tolerated, stayed close to the blade. The painting of battle scenes, the craft of weapons, the careful maintenance of armor. Even beauty was forced to serve function. Their leadership mirrored the same truth. The daimyo was expected to command, not to cultivate prosperity or negotiate lasting peace. Advisors were valued for tactical clarity, not political subtlety. Choices were judged by military effect, not by cost to the harvest or the stability of tomorrow. The clan was not managed. It was directed, like troops. Honor in Asakura life was welded to combat. To die in battle was praised. To die of age was endured. To avoid battle was shame. Women gained status by raising warriors and holding households together so men could remain focused on fighting. The moral system did not reward compassion or balance. It rewarded participation in the clan's single meaning and punished anything that interrupted it. Peace was not a relief, it was a threat. In rare lulls, the clan did not settle. It drifted. Warriors trained for battles that weren't coming yet. Resources piled up without a clear target. Young men, shaped from childhood to deliver violence with discipline, grew restless when there was nowhere to pour it. Peace felt like suspension, like standing still in a world that only made sense in motion. The silence wasn't safety. It was confusion. Over time, the clan developed a dependency that ran deeper than economy. War was not only how the Asakura survived, it was how they understood themselves. Their social structures required conflict to function. Their values required it to feel true. Their sense of meaning demanded an enemy on the horizon. A generation without war would not simply be bored. It would be unmade. Even their reputation hardened into a cage. Other powers learned the Asakura as relentless, difficult to bargain with, slow to yield, unwilling to treat defeat as final. That reputation had value. It made enemies cautious. It made allies feel secure. But it also locked the clan into patterns they could not break without breaking their own name. If you are known for never stopping, what happens the first time you do? The stories they carried answered that question in advance. The heroes were not those who won decisive battles. The heroes were those who continued when victory was impossible. Ancestors were revered not for clever retreats, but for refusing to step back, even when stepping back would have saved lives. The clan's memory didn't celebrate endings, it celebrated endurance. Young warriors absorbed those stories like instruction. Your purpose was not to win. Winning ended things, and endings were fragile. Your purpose was to embody the Asakura as people who did not stop. It produced men of frightening commitment, but it also produced rigidity. They would die before retreating. That made them terrifying opponents. It did not always make them effective. The economy was built around keeping that machine fed. Farmers produced rice to sustain fighters. Craftsmen worked metal into armor and weapons. Merchants acquired materials not for comfort, but for readiness. Taxes did not flow toward public welfare. They flowed toward the next campaign. Civilian life existed to support the warrior class. The warrior class existed to fight. It worked, so long as war never paused, but there was no cushion, no alternative trade, no robust market culture, no institutions designed to survive without conflict. The Asakura had no practice at becoming something else. They had built a machine for one task, and everything else was treated as distraction. You could see it in the land itself. Castles were maintained with obsessive care. Roads were cleared so troops could move fast. Fortifications impressed the eye, yet irrigation received less devotion. Markets stayed thin. Schools beyond training did not exist. The landscape was a ledger of priorities. Stone and steel elevated. Everything else kept merely functional. Allies valued them for reliability in battle and struggled with them everywhere else. Negotiations were difficult. Economic cooperation held little interest. Political compromise was resisted as if it were corrosion. In war, they were useful. In peace, they were a problem. Others worked with the Asakura because they had to, not because they wanted to. Inside the clan, dissent could not breathe. To question the primacy of war was treated as betrayal. To suggest adaptation was weakness. To propose peace was cowardice. Anyone capable of reimagining their future was pushed aside or silenced, leaving only those who embodied the same inherited certainty. The culture protected itself by removing the tools that could have changed it. So the loop tightened. Their identity demanded warfare, so they pursued warfare, and each conflict reinforced the identity. There was no exit. No lever to pull, no story in their blood that explained how to stop and still remain Asakura. Continuation became the only option that felt like meaning. The Sengoku period rewarded that flaw. Japan fractured into endless struggle, alliances forming, collapsing, reforming, territories changing hands, conflicts erupting without warning. In that chaos, the Asakura felt at home. Their values were practical, their identity was functional, their world finally matched the shape of their soul, but worlds shift, and the Asakura were about to meet something their entire culture was built for, and yet could not survive. An enemy they understood so completely that fighting them became the only purpose worth having. The rice harvests began to fail, not from blight or weather, but from absence. There were not enough farmers left to work the fields. Generations of young men had been siphoned into war until agriculture was carried by the elderly, by women, by children with hands too small for the tools. Fields that once produced surplus now barely fed whoever remained. The clan that had organized everything around military strength was starving because of it. The resources that kept the war alive drained faster each season. Iron grew scarce. Timber was stripped from nearby forests until even arrow shafts became precious. Rope and cloth, simple things that held an army together, were difficult to find because the craftsmen who made them had been conscripted, displaced, or buried. The logistics that once sustained campaign after campaign started collapsing under their own weight. The population told the truth no one wanted to consider. At the beginning, Asakura territory held more than 50,000 people. A century of constant conflict reduced that to fewer than 20,000. Villages went silent. Houses stood open to wind. Castles built for hundreds of defenders were manned by dozens. The clan was not just weakening, it was disappearing. The Yamana suffered the same erosion. Their numbers shrank. Their supplies thinned. Their strength became a shadow of what it had been. Both clans were hollowed out by the war that defined them, yet they kept fighting because stopping was no longer a strategic choice. It was a conceptual impossibility. They were bleeding each other with the last strength they had left. Even the land that had once been worth killing for turned worthless. The borderlands had been trampled so many times that nothing grew there anymore. Fields were ruined by neglect and repeated burning, sometimes salted by accident, sometimes by spite. Villages were destroyed and never rebuilt. The territory both sides fought to control was being erased by the fighting itself. By then, victory meant ruling over ruins. Strategic objectives dissolved. Early in the conflict there had been goals. Secure this pass, hold that river, take this castle. Now battles happened because battles always happened. Ground was taken and lost and taken again, without anyone clearly stating why it mattered. The war had become mechanical, momentum without purpose, tradition masquerading as necessity. Victories became meaningless in their own way. The Asakura might kill 200 Yamana in a successful engagement, then lose 150 of their own. With their population already broken, those losses were unsustainable. Each win brought them closer to having no one left who could hold a weapon. In terms of long-term survival, victory and defeat began to look identical. As resources vanished, sacrifices escalated. Earlier generations had marched with proper equipment, training, and support. Now, the clans sent boys with improvised weapons and minimal preparation. 14-year-olds marched because there were no 18-year-olds left. They died quickly, often without even understanding what they were dying for, only that they were supposed to. Young warriors knew they fought the Yamana, but they did not know why the Yamana were enemies. The original causes had faded into nothing. The goals no longer existed. They died because their fathers had died, because their grandfathers had died, because dying was what Asakura warriors did. Purpose had been replaced by precedent. Some of the young asked questions anyway. Why are we fighting? What happens if we win? Could we negotiate peace? Those questions were dangerous because they had no answers. The war continued because it always had. Victory could not be defined without admitting it was unreachable. Peace was impossible because identity depended on war, and identity was the only thing the clan still possessed. Leadership could not propose an end without shattering itself. An Asakura daimyo who suggested peace would be seen as betraying everything the clan claimed to be. Advisors would turn on him. Warriors would refuse him. Authority depended on keeping the war alive, even when keeping it alive meant mutual destruction. The few who recognized the insanity in private were still trapped by it. They understood the clan was dying. They understood the war had become slow suicide, but proposing change was its own death sentence. The culture was too rigid, the identity too dependent on conflict, the narrative too deeply embedded. Knowing the problem and solving it were separated by a distance no one could cross. Meetings among Asakura leadership became rehearsals of denial. Reports described declining numbers, depleted resources, and casualties that could not be replaced. The facts were acknowledged, then politely ignored. Plans were drawn for the next campaign, as if the trend would reverse by willpower alone. Reality was visible, yet forbidden from shaping decisions. That contradiction spread through the clan like strain in old wood. Everyone could see the deterioration. Empty villages, malnourished children, weapons that barely held together. And still everyone insisted the war must continue, that victory was possible, that sacrifice meant something. Observation and belief collided, and the only way to live with it was to stop looking too closely at either. The elderly remembered when the clan had been strong, when resources were ample, when battles had weight, when survival still felt plausible. They watched the decline with horror and said nothing, because to speak plainly meant admitting that a century of sacrifice had purchased nothing. Silence was easier than that admission. Children inherited a world that did not align with its own promises. They were told the clan was honorable and powerful while watching hunger and weakness spread. They were taught that warriors were glorious while seeing teenagers die in meaningless skirmishes. They were raised to uphold traditions that were visibly failing. The contradiction was not a problem to solve. It was the atmosphere they breathed. Asakura territory became a landscape of self-inflicted ruin. Forests burned down to scars that would not recover for decades. Fields surrendered to weeds. Roads that once connected living villages now led to empty spaces where villages had been. Castles were still maintained, obsessively, but they began to crumble anyway, because there were not enough craftsmen left to repair them. And yet the clan framed its suffering as something done to them, not something chosen. The Asakura blamed Yamana aggression, never their own inability to stop. They saw themselves as defenders, not as participants in mutual destruction. That framing preserved identity while stripping away responsibility. Outside mediation only sharpened their isolation. From time to time, more powerful daimyo offered to broker peace between Asakura and Yamana, offers rejected with hostility by both sides. Intervention was treated as insult, as if the war were a private matter rather than a catastrophe poisoning the region. But isolation served a purpose. Accepting mediation meant accepting that outsiders understood the conflict more clearly than the people trapped inside it. It meant admitting irrationality. It meant risking an end negotiated on paper, which would force the unbearable thought that all previous deaths had been avoidable. So the doors stayed shut. By then, the economy had become purely extractive. Leadership took everything the population could still provide and fed it into war. There was no investment in infrastructure, no development of trade, no planning for survival. The clan consumed itself openly. Everyone saw it. No one stopped it. Morale was sustained through ritual instead of reality. Ceremonies honored the dead, speeches invoked ancient glory, symbols were displayed like armor. For a moment, these performances restored a sense of purpose, but they were performances, and everyone knew the difference between ceremony and substance, even if they could never admit it out loud. The Asakura were trapped by their own past. Every generation had sacrificed. To admit the war was pointless would mean those sacrifices were meaningless. That admission was psychologically impossible, so the war continued. The dead held the living hostage through memory, and while the Asakura stayed frozen inside a conflict that no longer made sense, the world around them was reorganizing, quietly, efficiently, into something they would not recognize until it finally turned and broke them. Honor had become indistinguishable from repetition. The Asakura believed they honored their ancestors by doing exactly what their ancestors had done, fighting the Yamana in the same ways, with the same instincts, dying in the same patterns. Innovation wasn't treated as improvement, it was treated as disrespect. To change methods implied the old ones had been wrong, and if the old ones were wrong, then the dead had died for mistakes. That conclusion was unthinkable. So tradition hardened into doctrine. What had once been effective became mandatory. Tactics that belonged to earlier decades were used as if time had not moved. Frontal cavalry charges were launched even when terrain turned them into slaughter. Sieges were conducted with methods so familiar they were easily countered. The Asakura fought as their grandfathers had fought, not because it worked, but because it was the proper way to fight. Younger commanders who suggested alternatives were not debated, they were accused. Proposing new tactics sounded like criticism of the old. Criticizing the old sounded like insulting the warriors who had relied on them. And insulting fallen warriors was the deepest offense in Asakura culture. So new ideas died in meetings before they ever reached the field. The same errors returned generation after generation, like a ritual that demanded blood. Retreat became conceptually equivalent to betrayal. A commander who withdrew to preserve forces wasn't being strategic, he was abandoning duty. The expectation was simple: fight until victory or death, with no third option. Every engagement carried the gravity of a final stand, because leaving alive could be treated as worse than dying. This rigidity didn't just lose battles, it wasted people. Clashes that could have been broken off became massacres because withdrawal was forbidden. Men who could have been saved were destroyed because survival required dishonor. The clan hemorrhaged experienced warriors not always because enemies outmatched them, but because their own values made intelligent warfare impossible. Those who did retreat faced consequences designed to teach the rest. Commanders who pulled back to save their men were stripped of rank. Warriors who fell behind the line were punished as cowards. Survivors of disasters were blamed for surviving, treated with suspicion as if living itself were evidence of moral failure. The system punished people for not dying, ensuring they would die the next time. Adaptation was viewed as weakness. When the Yamana shifted tactics, the Asakura did not respond by changing. They responded by intensifying tradition. When enemy strategies evolved, Asakura strategies stayed fixed. They called it strength, maintaining identity under pressure. In practice, it was suicide through stubbornness. Even the hierarchy of praise was corrupted. The most honored warriors were often the least effective. A general who died leading a doomed charge was celebrated without reservation. A commander who achieved results through cautious maneuver and clever timing was respected, but rarely revered. Death was placed above success. Purity was placed above outcome, and over time, that preference shaped the kind of leaders who rose. Ambitious young commanders learned the lesson early. Dying gloriously was a faster path to legacy than winning efficiently. Survival began to look suspicious, as if it suggested hesitation or incomplete commitment. The safest way to secure honor was to die in the most visible way possible. The culture rewarded maximum commitment, even when that commitment was indistinguishable from folly. Strategy was inherited rather than developed. The Asakura kept traditional answers for every situation, passed down like family heirlooms. These were taught as rules, not tools. Commanders were expected to apply old solutions to new conditions regardless of fit. Strategic thinking, assessment, improvisation, adaptation was replaced by institutional memory. That made every campaign predictable. Enemies could anticipate their approach because the Asakura always approached the same way. The Yamana learned to prepare defenses, not by guessing, but by remembering. Yet predictability was not treated as a flaw. It was framed as proof of consistency, proof of honor, proof of fidelity to the dead. Being recognizable mattered more than being effective. And when these traditional strategies failed, the failure was never blamed on the strategies. It was blamed on insufficient devotion. If a frontal assault was repulsed, the conclusion wasn't that frontal assaults were wrong. It was that the warriors had not fought hard enough, so the next assault was identical, only heavier, bloodier, more desperate. They repeated the same action until there was nothing left to spend. Training reflected the same imprisonment. Young warriors were drilled to execute traditional techniques with precision, not to think. They memorized maneuvers for fixed scenarios. They were taught choreography, not judgment. When conditions shifted, terrain, weather, surprise, deception, they had no internal permission to adjust. All they could do was intensify commitment to what they had been taught. Identity was placed above reality at every level. Being Asakura meant fighting in Asakura ways, even when those ways guaranteed defeat. Clan identity was protected more fiercely than clan survival. No one said it openly, but every decision proved it. The clan would rather die as itself than live as something altered. This created a particularly cruel form of blindness. Scouts returned with reports, enemy positions, strength preparations. Intelligence existed, knowledge was collected, but commanders ignored it when it contradicted tradition. Facts were permitted to be seen, but not permitted to matter. Decisions were pre-written by honor. Reality could not edit them. Some warriors understood exactly what was happening. They could see tactics failing. They could see leadership trapped inside ritual. They could sense the entire structure breaking. But recognition changed nothing. Refusal meant dishonor worse than death. So they marched anyway, knowing the outcome, unable to choose differently. The clan could not stop because stopping required admitting error. Every battle lost, every resource drained, every child buried. If the war could have ended earlier, then all of it was avoidable. The longer it continued, the larger the investment became, and the more impossible it was to face the possibility that the investment was a mistake. That created acceleration toward collapse. As casualties mounted, the pressure to justify them increased. Justification required continuing. Continuing created more casualties. The loop fed itself, tightening until exhaustion was the only remaining endpoint. Leaders were trapped just as tightly as the warriors they commanded. A daimyo could privately understand the war was unwinnable and still be unable to act on that knowledge. His authority depended on maintaining identity. Identity demanded the war, so truth and action split apart completely. Hopelessness in private, demands for commitment in public. Advisors who suggested alternatives were removed, not always with violence, sometimes with quiet dismissal, reassignment, disappearance from influence. The effect was the same. Leadership surrounded itself with agreement, and dissent was purged until only enablers remained. The path toward collapse became self-confirming. The trap was complete. Honor required continuation. Continuation required sacrifice. Sacrifice demanded honor to feel like anything other than waste. The values that once guided survival became a prison built from virtue. And while honor paralyzed them from within, the world beyond them was consolidating into powers that would treat honor as irrelevant. Japan was changing at its foundations, while the Asakura remained frozen in place. Across the country, powerful daimyo were swallowing smaller territories and stitching them into larger, harder domains. The Sengoku period's fragmentation, its endless local, private wars, was giving way to consolidation. Lords who adapted to this new gravity grew stronger. Those who clung to old patterns were absorbed, outmaneuvered, or erased. Oda Nobunaga embodied the shift with brutal clarity. He did not fight for tradition. He fought to win and to unify. He embraced firearms while others still trusted the inherited romance of swords and bows. He made alliances for utility, not honor. He broke siege conventions by starving enemies rather than throwing bodies at walls. His methods worked precisely because they refused the old constraints. Where older clans saw rules, he saw obstacles. Other ambitious leaders moved with the same cold logic. Tokugawa Ieyasu built power through patience, alliances, and long calculation. Toyotomi Hideyoshi rose through merit rather than birth, proving that the old order was cracking in places it didn't want to acknowledge. These men represented a new kind of warfare, less identity, more arithmetic. They fought when it served them. They negotiated when it bought more than blood could. Victory mattered more than the shape of victory, and the battlefield itself was changing beneath everyone's feet. Firearms were reshaping war into something that made traditional samurai combat increasingly obsolete. A peasant with a musket could kill a warrior who had trained since childhood. Fortifications built to resist arrows could be pressured by cannon. Individual mastery, blade skill, personal bravery, the old measures of worth, began to matter less than organization, coordination, and adaptation. Large-scale efficiency replaced individual prowess as the decisive force. Armies that could move as units, supply themselves reliably, and communicate across distance started to dominate those who relied on smaller bands of elite fighters. Logistics became as important as courage. The old ideal of warrior against warrior gave way to systems, planned, supplied, sustained. War stopped being a contest of men. It became a contest of structure. Politics shifted with it. Alliances replaced direct confrontation as the primary tool of power. The most successful daimyo understood that absorbing enemies through negotiation was cheaper than conquering them through endless battle. Marriage ties, economic agreements, formal concessions, these achieved what sword fights could not. The strongest leaders spent as much time bargaining as they did campaigning, because they understood something the old world resisted. Former enemies could become useful if the terms were right, but that demanded skills the Asakura had never cultivated. Clans thriving in this new reality learned to compromise without shame. They could offer concessions and accept them. They could trade autonomy for security, pride for survival. past grievances for future stability. In that emerging landscape, flexibility became strength. The Asakura had no such flexibility. Their entire culture had been built around fighting the Yamana. To negotiate with their defining enemy would not feel like strategy. It would feel like self-erasure. And beyond that, they were psychologically at war with the idea of compromise itself. Their identity was not designed for partnerships. It was designed for confrontation. As consolidation accelerated, true states began to form from merged clan territories, centralized authorities with unified command, standardized laws, and coordinated economies. These structures could mobilize resources on a scale individual clans could never match. They did not fight like clans. They operated like machines. Smaller clans faced a narrowing set of choices: dissolve into larger powers and accept subordinate roles in exchange for safety and continued relevance, or adapt fast enough to become valuable to someone stronger. Many chose dissolution. Their leaders traded independence for survival because identity became negotiable when annihilation was the alternative. Others adapted by specializing. Clans controlling strategic resources, holding key territory, or offering unique military value could maintain partial autonomy by becoming indispensable. They remained distinct but integrated, protected by the larger system they served. The Asakura did neither. They could not dissolve because their identity was non-negotiable. They could not adapt because adaptation meant changing what they were. They stayed locked in their private war with the Yamana while the world around them moved toward a kind of conflict that made their struggle feel outdated, almost extinct. They had become a relic still swinging its blade in an age that had learned to reload. The old system of independent clans waging endless small wars was dying. It was being replaced by fewer, larger powers competing for total control. This wasn't gradual evolution. It was replacement. The rules that had governed war for generations were being overwritten by leaders who did not care about those rules. Leaders who measured success in territory held, supply lines maintained, and enemies eliminated efficiently. Clans that clung to older methods were destroyed with brutal speed. A traditional force might field 1,000 skilled samurai. A modernizing power could field 5,000 soldiers with firearms, supported by logistics that allowed campaigns to continue long after the first battle. The traditional clan would fight honorably and lose decisively. Honor offered no defense against scale, supply, and organization. The Asakura watched other clans disappear and failed to recognize they were watching their own future. When the Takeda were destroyed, they read it as Takeda weakness, not systemic change. When the Imagawa fell, they blamed poor leadership, not the shifting tide. Collapse happened around them, and they insisted they were different, special, immune. That denial was comfortable. It was also fatal. To admit they were becoming obsolete would require change, and change would require abandoning identity. So they kept fighting the Yamana as if context didn't matter, as if two exhausted clans tearing at each other could still shape Japan's destiny. Around them, unification advanced. Inside them, nothing moved. They became an anomaly. Other powers looked at the Asakura-Yamana conflict with confusion and contempt. Why were they still fighting? What did they even want? The territories involved were ruined. Neither clan held meaningful strategic value anymore. The war served no purpose anyone outside it could name, and that made them dangerous in a different way, not as threats, but as opportunities. Larger powers began to see both clans as resources to absorb, rather than enemies to respect. The Asakura and Yamana were so fixated on each other that they were exposed on every other side. Their long war had not made them strong. It had made them thin, weak in every direction except the one they couldn't stop watching. Emissaries arrived with offers framed as mercy. Join us, contribute your warriors, integrate into our system. In exchange, you receive security, supplies, and relevance. The terms were generous, not because the Asakura were feared, but because conquest, even against weakened opponents, still cost time and blood. The Asakura refused. Accepting meant ending the war with the Yamana. It meant submitting to authority beyond their own banners. It meant transforming from an autonomous warrior society into a component of someone else's machine. Practical benefits didn't matter. Identity was not negotiable, not at any price. That refusal sealed their trajectory. They would not dissolve voluntarily. They could not adapt fast enough to matter. They would not negotiate with the Yamana, and they would not bend to outside powers. Every path narrowed to one, continued fighting until collapse, and collapse was no longer a private possibility. It was now an outside schedule. The world had moved on. Warfare had transformed. Authority was centralizing, and the Sengoku period was bleeding toward an end that would not tolerate persistent disorder. The Asakura's war with the Yamana was disorder, small, contained but stubborn. It would be resolved whether they chose to or not. And when external powers finally reached into Ekizen to end it, they would learn something the Asakura had never learned themselves. The clan would rather die than stop fighting. The experienced commanders were gone. Decades of warfare had erased them the way weather erases stone, not in one moment, but steadily until expertise itself became rare. The generals who could read a battlefield, who understood timing, who knew when to commit and when to pull back, most had died honorably, which meant they had died predictably, and now they were simply dead. Their replacements were promoted too early, not because they were ready, but because no one else remained. 25-year-olds commanded armies. 30-year-olds were treated as veterans. These young leaders had energy and devotion, but they lacked the judgment that comes from surviving your own mistakes. They made choices seasoned commanders would never have made, and their men paid for it with their bodies. Training followed the same collapse. Earlier generations had years to harden warriors. Now they had months. Replacements were needed immediately, so preparation became a rush toward the front. Boys were taught to hold a weapon, shown the outline of a formation, and marched into battle. They did not learn war. They learned how to die inside it. The results were inevitable. Under pressure, hastily trained fighters broke formation. When plans failed, they panicked. They had been taught procedures, not principles, steps to follow, not judgment to improvise. They filled ranks like numbers, not like roles. The Asakura still had an army on paper, but what marched under their banners was increasingly an army in name only. Their equipment told the same story of depletion. Armor became makeshift. Weapons were poorly maintained. Supplies were thin. Warriors went to war with swords repaired so many times the original blade had nearly disappeared beneath patches and compromises. Armor was scavenged, pieces tied together from whatever could be salvaged. Arrows were carved from whatever wood could be found, regardless of quality. That material weakness punished them before the first clash. A sword that might break mid-strike was worse than no sword, because you committed your life to it. Ill-fitting armor restricted movement and turned endurance into exhaustion. Unreliable arrows could not be trusted, which meant they could not be aimed, which meant they were noise instead of force. The Asakura fought at a disadvantage that courage could not correct. To keep men moving forward, morale was fed by mythology. Warriors heard stories of ancient victories, ancestors who triumphed through spirit alone. They were taught that commitment mattered more than equipment, that honor overcame material disadvantage, that the Asakura way would prevail because it always had. The stories were necessary. They were also lies. The reality was that morale was rotting. Everyone could see the decline. Everyone knew the war was unwinnable, but doubt was dangerous to speak. So public confidence became performance while private despair deepened. Men marched with forced enthusiasm and genuine dread, carrying traditions like weights. Defeats began to arrive faster and end sooner. Where earlier generations might have fought for days, battles now lasted hours before Asakura lines collapsed. Poor training, inferior equipment, and shrinking numbers made sustained resistance impossible. They fought, they broke, they fled, or they died. The pattern repeated with a rhythm that felt inevitable. Each defeat accelerated the next. Losses removed survivors who might have trained replacements. Fewer warriors meant the next battle was fought with weaker ranks. Lost ground meant fewer resources for the following campaign. The clan was not losing a war in a single direction. It was dissolving through accumulation. Territory was abandoned not as strategy, but as inability. Castles held by Asakura banners for generations were left empty because there were no men to garrison them. Villages were evacuated because they could not be defended. The clan's footprint shrank year by year, not through a decisive blow, but through shrinking capacity. Abandonment produced refugees inside Asakura territory. Families fled indefensible regions and crowded into whatever areas still felt marginally secure. Resources that were already insufficient now had to feed the displaced. Infrastructure buckled under strain. What remained of Asakura land became a pressure vessel. Hunger, fear, and exhaustion compressed into tighter space. With real victory impossible, the clan became dependent on symbolic glory. When an occasional battle was won, often through luck or enemy mistakes rather than Asakura competence, it was celebrated as proof of viability, proof that the cause still lived, proof that the ancestors still watched, proof that continuing made sense. But symbols couldn't reverse material reality. A minor victory did not restore the warriors lost in a dozen defeats. Invoking ancestral spirits did not create rice, iron, or timber. Mythology kept the war alive in the mind, while the war dismantled the body. Inside, cohesion began to fracture. Survivors questioned why they were still fighting. Families that had lost fathers, sons, and brothers struggled to maintain belief. Villages that had given men and supplies repeatedly with nothing to show for it began to resist. The old social contract, sacrifice in exchange for survival, started to crack. Some warriors deserted. Not many. Desertion was still culturally unthinkable for most, and the punishment remained severe. But the fact that any deserted at all was a sign of how desperate things had become. Men raised to value honor above life were choosing life. The culture was failing even among those it had shaped most completely. Leadership responded the only way it knew how: denial and intensification. Defeats were met with demands for greater commitment rather than new strategy. Resource collapse was met with greater extraction from civilians rather than reduced operations. Weakening morale was met with harsher punishment for doubt rather than addressing the reasons for despair. It created a downward spiral. Harsh measures alienated the population. Alienation reduced cooperation. Reduced cooperation meant fewer resources. Fewer resources meant more defeats. More defeats justified harsher measures. The leadership's answer to crisis became the engine of the crisis. The elderly watched with resignation. They remembered the clan at its peak, when resources were sufficient, when campaigns were sustained, when the war still felt survivable. They knew the comparison revealed a trajectory toward collapse, but they said nothing, because naming it meant admitting their own sacrifices had helped build this end. Children grew up surrounded by death and decline. They did not remember better times because better times had never existed within their lives. War was not a phase. It was the environment. Poverty was not temporary, it was permanent. Their world was ending, but it was the only world they knew. So they had no language for what was being lost. The clan disintegrated from within, not through betrayal or revolution, but through exhaustion. Systems failed because there was no capacity left to maintain them. People died not only in battle, but from hunger, disease, and the collapse of basic infrastructure. The war was killing the Asakura more effectively than any enemy could, and this disintegration was visible to nearly everyone, except those still making decisions, or perhaps not except, but including, and yet still unspoken. Warriors knew the situation was hopeless. Farmers knew the fields could not feed what remained. Craftsmen knew they could not keep equipment functional. Everyone understood, and understanding changed nothing, because admitting it meant responsibility. And as the Asakura decomposed inside their own war, a final generation was being raised. children who would inherit nothing except the obligation to continue a fight that had already killed everything worth fighting for. The young warriors of the final generation had never known real victory. They heard stories about ancestors who had won battles, taken ground, achieved glory, but their own lives contained only loss. They trained, they marched, they fought, they broke, they retreated. That was the cycle. Victory belonged to mythology, something spoken of in halls, not something witnessed on a field. It produced warriors without confidence. They went into battle expecting to lose, and expectation became gravity. They executed tactics already proven useless, not out of faith, but out of habit. They fought because they were supposed to, not because they believed fighting could change anything. Hope had been burned out and replaced by grim obligation. Loyalty remained, but it had been severed from reward and even from reason. These young men stayed loyal to a clan that could not feed them well, could not equip them properly, could not explain what they were still dying for. And still they stayed, because disloyalty was unthinkable. They had been shaped from birth to serve, and alternatives did not feel like doors. They felt like cliffs. Their loyalty was tragic in its purity. It wasn't transactional. They did not serve for payment or advancement. It wasn't inspired. They did not believe in any shining purpose. It was simply the only identity they possessed. They were Asakura warriors, and being Asakura warriors meant fighting until death. So they fought. The loyalty was complete, and it was wasted. Sacrifice had become so common it lost its meaning. Earlier generations sacrificed believing it would shift outcomes. The last generation sacrificed already knowing it would not. They died in battles that changed nothing. They endured hardships that produced no future. Sacrifice was no longer extraordinary. It was routine. Families sent sons to war knowing they would not come back. Fathers trained boys for combat, knowing the training was preparation for death, not life. Mothers said goodbye with the calm precision of people who no longer expected miracles. The social structure functioned on a silent assumption. Young men existed to be spent. Grief was constant, but it had to be contained, because to show it openly was to admit what the system was doing. Honor drifted free of anything that made it real. Warriors were told they fought honorably. But honor did not protect them. It did not feed their families. It did not prevent defeat. It became a word used to make waste sound noble, to convert meaningless death into something that could be spoken aloud without breaking the listener. The young understood this, at least in part. They knew honor had become a narrative imposed on their suffering to keep it acceptable, but rejecting honor meant rejecting everything they were. So they performed it, speaking its language, following its rituals, dying its deaths, while carrying a quiet awareness that it was performance. Outside the walls, the land testified without restraint. Fields that once fed thousands lay empty, not resting, but abandoned because there was no one left to work them. Forests were either overgrown or stripped. Roads that had once connected villages led to ruins. The environment reverted toward wilderness because civilization requires stability, and stability had been bled out. The villages that remained were populated by the very young, the very old, and those unable to fight. Everyone else was dead or at war. These communities barely functioned. Harvests shrank because the workforce was gone. Repairs were delayed until they were no longer possible. Life narrowed into survival without surplus, existence without development. Castles stood as monuments to purposes they no longer served. They had been built to project power, but the clan had no power left to project. They were designed to shelter populations that were gone. They were maintained out of habit, and because abandoning them would be admitting defeat. Stone and timber became symbols that had outlived what they symbolized. Inside those castles, life was hollowed out. Ceremonies continued because they always had. Meetings were held where strategies were discussed, though everyone understood the strategies would fail. Reports were delivered, shortages, declining numbers, losses that could not be replaced, then filed away and ignored. The machine still made its motions, even as its parts fell away. Families lived in perpetual, anticipatory grief. Parents raised children knowing they would lose them. Siblings formed bonds already aware those bonds would be severed. Marriages took place under the shadow of expected widowhood. Relationships were made with a deadline, and that changed their entire texture. People adapted in different ways. Some loved intensely, compressing devotion into whatever time remained. Others held back, protecting themselves from grief by never investing fully. Both were rational responses to a world that punished attachment. Both were strategies for enduring a system designed to take what mattered most. Children raised in this environment developed differently than those before them. Loss was not an interruption, it was normal. Death was not exceptional, it was expected. They learned not to imagine futures, because futures did not belong to people like them. Decline shaped them until they could not picture life outside it. Some children asked questions their parents had stopped asking. Why are we fighting? What happens if we stop? Could we live differently? The questions were dangerous because they had no sanctioned answers. Parents deflected them, punished them, or repeated the same empty responses they had inherited. The questions persisted anyway, unresolved like pressure under a sealed lid. A few families tried to escape. They left Asakura territory, abandoning clan identity to save their children. That choice was condemned as betrayal, choosing family over clan, survival over honor. Those who stayed spoke of the fugitives with anger, but beneath the anger lived something closer to envy. Most remained, because leaving meant becoming nothing. Asakura identity was all they had. Beyond the clan's land, they would be refugees, without status, without protection, without community. The choice became simple and unbearable: die as Asakura, or survive as no one. Many chose the former because the latter felt like erasure. By then, the clan no longer knew how to exist except through war. Peace was not just the absence of fighting, it was the absence of identity. What would warriors do if they did not fight? What would children become if they were not shaped into warriors? What would the clan be if it was not martial? No one had answers, because no one had permitted the questions to exist. That made the war unclosable, even as it became obviously terminal. Stopping required imagining an alternative life. An alternative life was unimaginable. So the war continued, consuming the last food, the last weapons, the last boys, destroying what little remained. Not because anyone believed it could be won, but because stopping meant facing a silence filled with questions, and questions with no answers. The final generations were trapped completely, born into a dying structure, raised for a war that no longer made sense, loyal to a clan that could not protect them, unable to imagine existence outside the thing that was killing them. They inherited catastrophe, the way other children inherit land. And as this last generation reached adulthood, the external forces that had been patient were patient no longer. The collapse did not come with a climactic battle. There was no final siege, no heroic last stand, no moment where the Asakura fought to the last warrior under a burning banner. The end arrived in a form they had never trained for: bureaucratic, administrative, undignified. A larger power, one of the consolidating daimyo unifying Japan, simply declared the Asakura-Yamana conflict finished. It would be absorbed into a wider domain. Order would be imposed. The war would stop because someone with enough strength said it would. Emissaries brought the terms like a verdict. Both clans would dissolve as independent entities. Their lands would be integrated. Their warriors would be offered a choice: serve the new lord or be pensioned off. Resistance would be met with overwhelming force neither exhausted clan could counter even if it wanted to. Acceptance or annihilation, not negotiation, not honor, administration. Asakura leadership faced a choice that was not really a choice. They could fight and be erased within days, or they could accept and cease to exist as Asakura. Either way, the ending was unavoidable. After generations of choosing violence reflexively, they chose peace for a simpler reason. They no longer had the capacity for anything else. The Yamana reached the same conclusion. The war that had shaped both clans for over a century ended, not because either side won, but because a third party terminated it. The conflict that had felt eternal, one that consumed lives, structured societies, defined identity, stopped because someone outside it decided it had become intolerable. It was defeat without battle, and somehow that humiliation cut deeper than conquest. The Asakura had not been beaten in a final test of strength. They had been made irrelevant. Their war was dismissed as local disorder, requiring administrative resolution. They were not enemies worthy of respect. They were a problem that had been solved. Dissolution moved quickly. Surveyors mapped land. Officials reassigned villages. Castles were garrisoned by the new lord's men. Tax systems were standardized. Records were rewritten. Within months, the bureaucratic entity called Asakura ceased to exist in any official sense. A name that had once meant command and blood became an entry absorbed into someone else's structure. The warriors were left with individual choices that felt like amputations. Some accepted service under the new lord. They became soldiers in coordinated armies, fighting for strategic purposes that had nothing to do with Ekizan's inherited hatred. Their skills were useful. Their identity was not. They were no longer Asakura warriors fighting for Asakura honor. They were troops following orders. Others refused. They became ronin, masterless samurai with no lord, no war, and no place in a reorganizing world. Some found work as guards or mercenaries, some slipped into poverty. A few turned to banditry. They carried Asakura identity like a relic, but there was nothing left to attach it to. They were ghosts of an institution that had vanished. The youngest adapted most easily. They had fewer memories to mourn, less investment in traditions that had failed them. For them, service under a new lord could look like opportunity rather than betrayal. They could imagine futures their elders had never permitted themselves to picture. The elderly suffered the dissolution as a kind of annihilation. They had sacrificed their entire lives to the clan and the war. They had lost children, siblings, friends. They had endured deprivation, believing it served something larger. Now they were told that something larger had been cancelled by external decree. Not defeated, cancelled. Their sacrifices did not even earn the dignity of a final battle. Some could not accept it. Old warriors tried to keep fighting, launching pointless raids against Yamana remnants or against the new administration's outposts. They were captured or killed quickly. Their resistance was not heroic, it was desperation, the flailing of people who had no other language for existence. They died as they had lived, fighting for something that no longer existed. The name Asakura survived longer than the clan. For years, people still identified themselves by lineage. They told stories. They kept pride in ancestry. But this was memory, not power. Heritage, not structure. The clan as a functioning entity, the thing that could command, tax, fight in force, was gone. It created identity without a body, people who were Asakura in blood, but for whom Asakura no longer meant anything practical. For those who remembered when the name carried weight, the disconnect was jarring. They lived in a world where their heritage had become irrelevant. Younger generations cared less. They knew they descended from the Asakura, but it was only a story. They had not lived the old obligations, and they did not feel bound by them. The identity diluted with each generation until it became purely genealogical, something you inherited, not something you lived. Officially, the war with the Yamana ended. Psychologically, it lingered in the people it had shaped. Old warriors carried hatred and grief with nowhere to place it. They remembered battles and losses, but the structures that gave those memories meaning were gone. War remained inside them, but there was no field left to carry it onto. This produced a specific kind of suffering, purposelessness, among people raised for singular purpose. From birth, they had been shaped to fight the Yamana. Their values, their skills, their sense of self had been built around that mission, and then the mission was removed, not by triumph or defeat, but by paperwork and authority. They were left with abilities no longer needed, values no longer rewarded, identities no longer comprehensible to anyone except themselves. Some tried to explain to the young what the clan had been, what the war had meant, why it had mattered, but the explanations collapsed under their own weight. A clan fighting itself to exhaustion over a conflict no one could justify sounded insane, because it was. Those who lived it had not been able to recognize it as madness while they were inside it. Now they could see it, but seeing it did not restore anything. Even the land forgot. Former Asakura castles were repurposed or dismantled, villages were renamed, roads were rerouted, the landscape was reorganized to serve new purposes. Within a generation, you could pass through what had been Asakura territory without knowing it had ever been Asakura. Later, historians would frame the Asakura-Yamana conflict as an example of Sengoku futility. Two clans destroying themselves over territory that had become worthless long before the fighting ended. It would become a cautionary tale, a neat lesson about wars that sustain themselves. For those who lived through it, there was no lesson. There was only loss. They had given everything to something that could be cancelled. They had built their lives around an identity that became obsolete. The meaning they had created was retroactively declared meaningless, and there was no appeal. In the end, the Asakura died fighting against the end of war. Not against an enemy in armor, but against the concept that war could end. They could not imagine existence without conflict, so when conflict was terminated, they could not exist inside the new world that replaced it. Some died physically. Others lived on, emptied out, but all of them died in the same way, by losing the thing that had made them who they were. That was the final meaning of the clan that refused to die. They refused stopping so long, and so stubbornly, that they lost the chance to end on their own terms. They clung to war until war was taken from them. And only then did they discover that without war, they did not know how to be anything at all. They had not feared defeat. They had feared a world without war. And when that world arrived, it did not defeat them in battle. It erased them. They did not fight to conquer. They fought because stopping was never an option. And sometimes, the most dangerous wars are not the ones you lose. They are the ones you no longer know how to end. If you want history beyond heroes and victories, subscribe to Fragments of History, because some wars survive the people who started them.